A shriek of wind rattled the metal shell of the unmarked truck as it ground to a halt on a snow-choked trail deep inside Glacier National Park. Darkness pressed in on every side, broken only by the frantic dance of headlights swirling through the whiteout. Staff Sergeant Ben Colson's hands trembled as he yanked open the back doors, cold air slicing through his uniform. But the shaking wasn't from the cold, it was guilt, an old, gnawing guilt that wouldn't let him look Ranger in the eyes. Ranger, a German shepherd with graying fur at his muzzle and a proud military bearing, waited in the darkness, alert and ready. His breath fogged in the air, ears pricked for a command. He knew only obedience, faith, and the certainty that his handler would never abandon him. The two of them had survived IEDs in Kandahar, patrols in the Rockies, training exercises in the dead of night. Ben had always been there at the end of the leash, a steady presence, a promise. But tonight there was only fear and something uglier. Ben's voice was ragged as he leaned in. "Sorry, buddy." He yanked off Ranger's collar, hands fumbling with the metal tag. "Do not abandon," stamped and half-worn. The words bit into Ben's palm as if mocking him. Ranger cocked his head, confused, waiting for an order. But Ben just whispered, "Forgive me," and shoved Ranger out into the blizzard. The dog staggered, limping from an old wound as the wind blasted his face. Ben slammed the doors and disappeared behind the wheel. The truck's taillights glowed for a heartbeat, then vanished into the white, leaving Ranger shivering in the storm. The cold bit deep. He tried to run after the truck, paws scrabbling on ice, but within seconds he lost all sense of direction. His world shrank to the roar of wind and the sting of betrayal. He wandered, desperate and bewildered, until his strength failed. Ranger slumped to the ground, the snow piling over his legs, his vest half hidden by ice. The patch, "Do not abandon," was the last thing visible before the darkness swallowed him. Panic battled with exhaustion. Why would Ben do this? What had he done wrong? Minutes bled into hours. The storm howled like a wounded animal, and Ranger's body began to stiffen, his vision tunneling to pinpricks of light. Memories flickered through his mind. Ben's laughter, the scent of gunpowder, the warmth of a campfire, the sharp snap of a command. Now there was only silence. Cold. A yawning, endless cold. Ranger tried to rise, but his legs were lead. Snow swirled and settled, erasing his tracks, erasing him. As his eyes closed, the last thing he felt was not pain, but confusion, an ache that went deeper than the cold. The storm buried him, as if the world itself had decided to erase his existence. But beneath the crushing white, the faint patch on his vest remained. "Do not abandon." The words, half frozen, glimmered in the storm's fury, a bitter joke, an accusation hurled into the void. Hours passed. Ranger's breathing slowed. His body, trained for battle, began to surrender. But somewhere inside, an old instinct, older than war, older than betrayal, refused to let go. There was a flicker of hope, an ember barely alive. Would someone come? Could he survive the night? Or was this how a hero died? Alone, unwanted, forgotten. The storm raged on, and Glacier National Park became a graveyard of secrets. A thin gray dawn pressed through the storm, casting everything in a blue, deathly haze. Beneath the snow, Ranger's heartbeat slowed to a whisper, each breath more painful than the last. The world around him was silent except for the faint grinding of ice against his fur and the pulsing ache in his muscles, torn between giving up and clinging to life. Inside Ranger's mind, memory and reality blurred. He saw flickers of the battlefield, smoke, fire, the echo of gunfire, Ben's steady hand on his harness. His body remembered the crack of explosions and the way adrenaline surged through him in the chaos. But now there was no one calling his name, no command to anchor him, only the wind and the bone-deep cold, gnawing at the last threads of his strength. Why had Ben left him? The question pounded in his mind, as sharp as the cold itself. Had Ranger failed? Was there something broken in him now? Something that made him unworthy of trust? He tried to move, but every nerve screamed in protest. Frost was creeping over his paws, biting into his skin. He tasted blood on his tongue from biting back whimpers that no one would hear. A crow landed on a nearby branch, ruffling its feathers and staring down with hungry black eyes. For a moment the bird's caw echoed in Ranger's head, a sound from another world, a world where he still mattered. He forced his head up, his vest, still half buried, pressed into his chest, a reminder of what he used to be. Giving up would be so easy, just a few more seconds and the pain would fade into the snow. But somewhere, deep inside, Ranger heard an old voice, not Ben's, but the first voice he ever knew. The woman who raised him, gentle and firm, before the military. "You're stronger than you think, pup. Don't let go." That voice, the memory of being loved, sparked something. With a trembling, desperate effort, Ranger forced himself to crawl forward. His legs didn't want to obey, but he dragged his body, inch by inch, until he found a hollow beneath a fallen log, barely shielded from the wind. He squeezed in, breath heaving. He could feel frost nipping at his ears and tail, his pulse thready and weak, his senses dulled, the world shrinking to a pinpoint. Sound faded. The storm became a distant drumbeat. He was close to the edge, of death, of surrender. He blinked and saw nothing but gray, and then a sound, muffled, unfamiliar. The crunch of boots over snow, labored and erratic, growing louder. Ranger's ears flicked, the old instincts shivering to life. Was it Ben? Was it someone come to finish what Ben started? Or could it be hope? He forced himself to listen, every muscle taut with fear and anticipation. The footsteps drew nearer, stumbling, dragging. A shape moved through the gloom, unsteady, barely more than a shadow at first. Ranger shrank deeper into his shelter, torn between the urge to hide and the desperate need for rescue. Through the snow, a figure collapsed onto his knees, panting, clutching at his side. Blood stained the white, shockingly red. The stranger's face was pale, beard rimed with frost, lips blue from cold and blood loss. He muttered to himself, voice hoarse and panicked. "Evidence. Got to. They'll kill us all if I don't." Ranger watched, motionless, heart pounding in his chest. The man crawled closer, dragging a heavy satchel. Every breath was agony for him, too, but he forced himself on, as if the snow was chasing him. He glanced around wildly, his eyes landing on the log where Ranger lay hidden. The man's voice broke. "Please, somebody, anybody." Ranger didn't move. His fear was too deep, his body too broken. But as the man slumped against the log, his hand brushed against the cold fur. Ranger flinched but didn't snarl or bite. The man recoiled, eyes wide, then caught sight of the faint military insignia on Ranger's vest. A dog. "Military. They sent you, didn't they?" The man coughed, spitting blood into the snow. "Or did they leave you too?" Silence stretched between them. In that brief frozen moment, something passed. A recognition, not just of uniforms and wounds, but of betrayal. Ranger saw the haunted look in the stranger's eyes, the same hollow ache that burned in his own. Both of them cast off and left to die. Both of them fighting the cold and the ghosts inside their minds. The man slumped forward, head resting on the log, voice barely a whisper. "I'm Marcus, Marcus Blackwell. You're a good boy, aren't you?" Ranger's ears flicked, uncertain. The name meant nothing. But the tone, the quiet pleading, the need for connection was familiar. It reminded him of the barracks, of wounded men clinging to hope, needing a friend more than a weapon. Ranger inched forward, the movement costing him all the strength he had left. He sniffed Marcus's trembling hand, catching the scent of blood, fear, and something else, determination. Marcus pulled his satchel closer, fingers fumbling with a zipper. "They're coming. Got to. Keep this safe." He drew out a flash drive and stuffed it inside his jacket, then pulled a blanket from the pack and draped it over Ranger, shivering. "Stay. With me. Please." The snowstorm raged on, relentless. But now, under the log, two lost souls shared a fragile circle of warmth, a circle of hope. Ranger's body pressed against Marcus's, heartbeat sinking, breath mingling. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The unspoken bond, the alliance of the abandoned, held them together through the darkness. As consciousness slipped away, Ranger heard the footsteps again, this time, not from the storm, but from memory. Ben's voice, Marcus's plea, the echo of trust betrayed and found again. For the first time since the blizzard began, Ranger let himself hope, not for rescue, but for one more chance to prove he still mattered. Outside, the storm began to break, just a little. Inside, two survivors clung to the edge, of death, of hope, of something new neither one could name. The storm slackened, leaving behind a world buried in white silence, as if the whole forest had forgotten how to breathe. Beneath the fallen log, Ranger woke slowly, every muscle stiff and numb. He could feel the weight of the blanket Marcus had draped over him, heavy with frozen snow and blood. His own breath came in slow, shallow puffs, fogging the cold air beneath the log. Somewhere nearby, the wounded man stirred, coughing, a wet, ragged sound that snapped Ranger to full alert. Ranger's first instinct was to vanish, to melt into the snow and escape the human world that had betrayed him, but his body wouldn't obey. He was pinned by cold, hunger, and something stranger, the quiet presence of Marcus Blackwell. The man's blood scent was sharp in the air, mingled with sweat, fear, and something burnt, gunpowder. Marcus muttered to himself, clutching his side, face contorted with pain. "Come on, Marcus, not now. Stay awake." Ranger watched him, wary. His eyes flicked to the satchel, the flash of something metal inside. Danger! Or was the real threat out there, beyond the trees, closing in? For a long moment, neither moved. Snowflakes drifted lazily to earth, blanketing the world in a hush. Ranger's ears flicked at every distant sound, the groan of a tree under ice, the far-off caw of a crow, the faint hiss of Marcus's breath. "Easy, easy," Marcus whispered, half to himself, half to Ranger. He pressed a makeshift bandage to his bleeding side, teeth clenched against the pain. "You're military, aren't you? K9. Can you understand me, boy?" Ranger tensed. He understood the tone, if not the words, a plea, raw and lonely, like a soldier calling for help in the dark. Ranger remembered nights in the barracks, the way the wounded would reach for him in the aftermath of chaos. He'd learned to read pain and need, to offer silent comfort even when the world was falling apart. Marcus fumbled through his satchel, hands trembling. He pulled out a battered canteen, tried to unscrew it, but his fingers slipped. Water splashed onto the snow. "Damn it," he whispered, voice frayed. "Come on, Marcus, pull it together." He leaned back, head against the log, and for a moment Ranger saw the boyish face beneath the grime and blood, a face exhausted by guilt and fear. Marcus glanced at Ranger, as if seeing him for the first time. "I don't know if you're real or just a ghost," he said, voice shaking. "But I need you, buddy, just for a little while. Don't let me die alone out here." Ranger inched forward, drawn by something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the way Marcus's voice softened at the edges, or maybe it was the memory of Ben's hand on his head, gentle and reassuring, before everything changed. Whatever it was, Ranger nudged Marcus's boot with his nose, cautious but unmistakable. Marcus's eyes filled with something like hope, or maybe just relief. He offered the canteen, water sloshing. "Here, drink, if you can." Ranger licked the cold metal, tasting water and blood. It hurt to swallow, but the water burned through the ice in his chest, just enough to keep him present. Marcus watched, a crooked smile flickering. "That's it. Good boy. You're a survivor, aren't you?" But the words hurt almost as much as the cold. Ranger thought of Ben, of the collar yanked from his neck, of the snow burying his body. He wasn't sure he wanted to survive. Not if it meant facing another betrayal. Marcus coughed again, blood spotting his lips. He gripped the satchel as if it might save his life. "They're coming for us," he whispered. "Military contractors. Not supposed to know, but I found out. Too much. Evidence about the K9 program. About what they do to dogs like you when you're inconvenient." Ranger cocked his head, sensing the tension in Marcus's voice, the tremor of fear and urgency. He'd heard humans argue before, in the dim corners of barracks and base camps. Words like disposal, retirement, and classified floated in the air, always followed by silence. Marcus's hand shook as he unzipped the satchel and revealed a flash drive taped with the words Canine Disposal Program, Top Secret. He looked at Ranger with haunted eyes. They thought they could get rid of us. They thought nobody would care if a few dogs and soldiers disappeared. A pause, then, "But I care, damn it. And I think you do too." Ranger watched, silent. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the pain, the bone-deep ache of being thrown away, of losing your place in the world. He crawled closer, laying his head on Marcus's knee, trusting him for a heartbeat. Marcus flinched, surprised, but then relaxed. He stroked Ranger's fur, tentative but grateful. "You and me, huh? Betrayed by the people we trusted most. Guess we're in this together." For the first time since the blizzard, Ranger felt something like warmth, not just the heat from Marcus's body, but a flicker of connection, fragile as ice in sunlight. The world was still cold and dangerous, but for a moment they were not alone. A branch snapped in the distance. Both Ranger and Marcus tensed, senses sharpening. Ranger's old training kicked in, adrenaline spiking. Was it help, or was it the threat Marcus had warned about, finally catching up? Marcus shoved the flash drive back into his jacket, eyes wild. "If I don't make it, you have to get this to someone. Anyone. Promise me, boy." Ranger pressed closer, gaze steady. Whatever happened next, he would not leave Marcus behind. Not now. Not after everything. The snow began to fall again, thick and heavy. But beneath the log, a wounded man and a battered dog formed a fragile alliance. Two broken soldiers, each clinging to hope, each saving the other from the dark. The sky slowly paled above Glacier National Park, stained pink at the edges where the storm had begun to break. The forest was all hush and ice, the world muffled beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Inside the cramped shelter beneath the fallen log, Ranger and Marcus Blackwell lay close, breathing in shallow, uneven rhythm. Marcus's hand shook as he clung to the battered satchel, blood blooming across his jacket from the gunshot wound. In the strange blue dawn, his face looked younger, almost boyish, but his eyes were dark hollows. Every so often, he would glance at the dog curled beside him, uncertain if this battered German shepherd was a guardian angel or just another ghost come to haunt his final hours. He reached out, fingers trembling, and spoke softly into the chill. "You're not just a tool, are you?" His words fell like stones in a well, heavy with regret. "I tried to do the right thing. God knows I tried, but nobody wanted to listen." Ranger lay still, watching Marcus through half-lidded eyes. He didn't understand the words, but the tone, a low confession, cracked with guilt, stirred something in him. For a moment, Ranger flashed back to the barracks, to men like Marcus sitting in the dark after patrols, voices shaking as they unloaded their burdens to anyone who would listen, dog or human. Ranger had always listened. It was what he did best. Marcus pressed a makeshift bandage to his side, breath hissing through clenched teeth. "You know what they did to us, boy. When we tried to tell the truth?" He stared into the trees, haunted. "They cut us loose, said we were crazy, said we were a threat." He coughed, the sound sharp and wet, and Ranger inched closer. Instinct told him to be wary. Humans could be dangerous when wounded or afraid, but something deeper tugged him forward. Marcus's voice was softer now, almost pleading. "I couldn't just let them throw you away too. You're not disposable. None of you are." He fumbled with the satchel, hands slick with blood, and pulled out the flash drive again. "Top secret," he muttered. "All the evidence. Names. Orders. I risked everything for this, and look where it got me." He gave a bitter laugh, shaky and hollow. "A bullet in my gut and a dog for company. Hell of a retirement party." Marcus's head slumped against the log, eyes fluttering shut. He was fading, each breath a struggle. The cold gnawed at his edges, but it was the blood loss that was dragging him down fastest. He tried to bandage the wound with a strip of his shirt, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. He slumped forward, the world tilting, pain and fever mixing until nothing made sense. Ranger shifted, nose twitching at the scent of fresh blood. Something primal stirred, a need to help, to heal. He remembered long nights at the field hospital, the way medics would patch up the wounded, the way Ben would rub his ears and say, "Good boy, Ranger, you keep them calm." He'd always been good at comforting, at least until Ben left him behind. With slow, careful movements, Ranger pressed his muzzle to Marcus's side, licking the wound with rough, gentle strokes. The taste of blood was sharp, but Ranger kept at it, cleaning away dirt and grit as best he could. Marcus groaned, eyelids fluttering, but didn't pull away. A strange warmth spread between them, fragile but real. In that moment, something shifted. Ranger was no longer just a tool or a ghost. He was a partner, a friend. Marcus's breathing steadied, his hand finding its way to the thick fur behind Ranger's ear, clutching it like a lifeline. "Thanks, buddy," Marcus mumbled, half-conscious. "Guess we're all we've got now." As Marcus faded in and out of sleep, Ranger kept watch. Every sound, branches cracking, snow shifting, the distant call of a crow, set his nerves alight. He pressed closer to Marcus, keeping him warm, guarding against threats both seen and unseen. He was fighting the old fear, the urge to bolt and disappear, but he refused to leave Marcus. Not when he'd just found someone as lost as himself. At dawn, Marcus jerked awake, fever bright and shivering. He looked around in panic as if expecting an ambush, but relaxed when he saw Ranger still beside him. "You're still here," he murmured. "Didn't run." He dug in his satchel and with the last of his strength pulled out a crumpled protein bar. He broke off a piece, holding it out. "Eat, boy. We need to stick together if we're going to make it." Ranger took the offering carefully, his tail thumping once in the snow. He ate, grateful for the energy, even if his stomach cramped with hunger and stress. And for the first time since the blizzard began, Ranger felt a glimmer of trust, a fragile alliance formed in the crucible of betrayal and survival. Suddenly, Marcus's hand slipped, sending the satchel tumbling. Papers and objects spilled out. Bandages, an old photograph of a smiling woman, and the flash drive marked Canine Disposal Program, top secret. Ranger's eyes followed the drive as it skittered across the snow. Marcus cursed softly, scrambling to gather his things. Ranger nudged the drive back toward Marcus with his nose, earning a weak, grateful smile. "Smart dog," Marcus said, voice hoarse. "Smarter than half the officers I served with." The sun crept higher, burning away some of the chill. But their sanctuary was still temporary. Ranger heard something in the distance, a faint rumble, not natural, not safe. His ears pricked. Trouble was coming, and soon, Marcus sensed it too. He drew the satchel close, voice steely now. "If something happens to me, you run. You get this to someone who can help. Promise me, boy." Ranger whined softly. He didn't know how to promise in words, but in that moment he resolved not to leave Marcus, no matter what. The betrayal that haunted him would not define him, not this time. They sat in silence, man and dog, battered but united. The forest seemed to breathe around them, holding its secrets close. Somewhere out there, hunters were closing in, drawn by the scent of fear and the promise of loose ends. But for now, in the quiet beneath the fallen log, two wounded souls held the line, defiant, unbroken, together. As the wind shifted, the flash drive glinted in a shaft of light, a silent promise that the truth and their fragile alliance might just be enough to change everything. The calm of the forest shattered as a mechanical growl cut through the frozen air. It started low, a distant, irregular rumble, then grew into a chorus of engines and angry voices echoing between the icy trees. Ranger's ears pricked up, every muscle going rigid. He recognized that sound. Trouble, not wild but human, the worst kind. Marcus was already awake, face gray and eyes hollow from pain and fever. He struggled to push himself upright, clutching at the satchel with one hand and reaching for a small pistol with the other. The movements were slow, desperate. He glanced at Ranger, reading the alarm in the dog's tense body and wild gaze. "Snowmobiles," Marcus croaked, voice rasping with exhaustion. "Contractors. They found us." Ranger's instincts kicked in, his old military training flaring back to life. He scanned the trees, nose twitching, body low to the ground, ready to move at a moment's notice. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but some habits never died. Not even after betrayal. Marcus clutched the flash drive to his chest. "They'll kill us for this," he whispered. "They'll kill you too. Your evidence, Ranger. Living, breathing evidence they want erased." The drone of snowmobiles drew closer, headlights flickering between the trees. Voices crackled over radios, harsh and cold. Through the shifting shadows, figures appeared, men in black parkas and mirrored goggles, rifles slung over their shoulders. At their front strode Commander Lee Ellis, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running the length of his jaw and a gaze like ice. His reputation for tracking down problems was whispered about in the kind of circles Marcus had spent his career exposing. Ranger could smell the tension, the anticipation of violence. Marcus fumbled in the satchel, pulling out a map and a battered field radio. "We can't fight them head-on," he muttered. "We've got to move. Can you walk, Ranger?" Ranger answered by nudging Marcus's arm and rising slowly, testing his battered legs. Pain shot through his body, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for weakness now. Marcus wrapped an arm around Ranger's neck for support, staggering to his feet. They slipped from the shelter of the log, snow muffling their escape. Behind them, voices barked commands and the engines whined as the hunters spread out. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, breath fogging in the air. "Ranger, listen. I know you're hurt, but you know these woods better than I do. I have to trust you." Ranger hesitated, doubt gnawing at him. Memories of failure, of Ben's last pained look, flickered across his mind. But when he looked at Marcus, he saw something different. Not a handler, but a partner, wounded and alone, willing to believe in him. With a soft grunt, Ranger led Marcus away from the clearing, weaving between trees, every sense straining. He'd been trained for combat zones and bomb sniffing, but nothing prepared him for the fear that now clawed at his chest. Not fear for himself, but fear for Marcus, the man who had risked everything, not just for justice, but for him. The woods closed in around them, branches sagging with snow. Ranger guided Marcus along the edge of a frozen creek, doubling back to cover their trail. The scent of gasoline and gun oil drifted closer. Marcus's breathing was ragged, his wound was bleeding again, staining the snow. But neither stopped. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air, a rifle shot, too close. Bark splintered above Ranger's head. Marcus ducked, gritting his teeth. "They're flanking us! Move!" Ranger surged forward, leading them through a tangle of underbrush and up a shallow ridge. The effort cost him, every limb screaming, but he refused to slow. The woods here felt different, older. He could sense other animals, foxes, deer, hiding, listening, fleeing the violence that man always brought. They reached a thicket of willows. Marcus slumped behind the cover, gasping for breath. He looked down at Ranger, sweat and blood freezing on his brow. "Dozens, Ranger. Dozens of dogs like you. Thrown away. Retired. Most didn't even make it out here. You're lucky. If you can call this lucky." Ranger listened, ears flat. He could feel Marcus's anger, not at the men behind them, but at the system, the quiet, orderly machinery of betrayal. Ranger pressed closer, his own body heat keeping Marcus awake. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the distant whine of engines. Then a shout, closer than before. "There! Footprints! They went this way!" Marcus's eyes widened with panic. "We're running out of time, boy. I have to trust you. Lead us out. You're the only one who knows these woods. Please." Ranger paused, trembling with fear and exhaustion. He closed his eyes and let instinct take over, reading the wind, the lay of the land, the faintest hint of safety. He circled, sniffing the ground, then moved north away from the gunfire toward a distant ridge that might give them cover. Marcus stumbled after him, clinging to Ranger's collar for balance. Every step was agony, but every step was survival. The pursuit was relentless. Shouts, more gunshots, the bark of radios. At one point, a contractor appeared in the trees ahead. Ranger froze, hackles raised. The man's gaze lingered on Ranger's vest. Recognition. Then hesitation. The man lowered his rifle just enough for Ranger and Marcus to vanish into the brush, hearts pounding. "They're not just hunters," Marcus whispered. "Some of them. They were canine handlers too. They know what you're worth, and what you're not." As the sun faded, Marcus and Ranger pushed onward, bodies battered but spirits unbroken. The woods had become a battleground, not just for their lives, but for the truth itself. Behind them, the hunters regrouped, anger and fear mounting. Ahead, only uncertainty. But for the first time, Ranger moved with purpose, no longer running from his past, but toward a future he would fight to claim. Not just for himself, but for every discarded soul left to freeze in the dark. Nightfall pressed hard against the trees, painting the world in long blue shadows and pockets of pitch-black darkness. Every step was torture for Marcus as he limped through the forest, clutching his side, blood still seeping sluggishly through the bandage. Ranger moved ahead, ears swiveling, nose testing every whiff of wind. The shouts and engines had faded behind them, but the sense of being hunted clung like a second skin. The wind was picking up again, tossing flurries of powder into the air, when Ranger suddenly froze. He pressed his belly to the snow, hackles up, tail rigid. Marcus dropped behind a tree, every sense burning with anxiety. For a long, breathless moment there was nothing. Then, from the gloom, headlights flashed, bright as sunrise. A hulking pickup truck barreled down a snow-packed trail, the engine roaring like a wild animal. The truck slid to a stop, its frame towering above the snowbanks. Out stepped a tall woman, broad-shouldered, her hair tied back under a fireman's knit cap, a flashlight gripped tight in one gloved hand. Beside her, a teenager, all elbows and energy, scrambled from the passenger side, eyes wide and searching the woods. Marcus tried to shrink further into the trees, but the woman's voice boomed, confident and no nonsense. "I know you're out there. If you need help, this is your chance. Come out now." Ranger looked at Marcus, searching for a cue. Marcus's mind raced. Was this another trap? But he could hear something different in the woman's tone. Not threat, urgency, compassion. The girl called out, her voice ringing with hope. "Dad? Mom? You sure it's safe?" The woman answered, "Stay behind me, Ellie. Let me do the talking." She scanned the woods, eyes landing on the flicker of movement where Ranger crouched, his silhouette just visible against the white. She knelt, lowering her flashlight. "Hey there, boy. You lost?" The sound of her voice made Ranger's ears twitch. The girl stepped forward, ignoring her mother's warning, and crouched low. "Is that a German shepherd? He looks hurt. Mom, let's help him." Ranger hesitated, torn between trust and terror. Marcus was fading, the world spinning with blood loss. "Help! We need help!" he croaked, barely loud enough to carry. The flashlight beam snapped to his face. The woman's posture changed instantly, training taking over. She moved quickly but calmly, approaching Marcus with practiced care. "Sir, you're bleeding. I'm Grace Linwood. I own the lodge up the road. My husband's a trauma nurse. Let us help you." Marcus sagged in relief, all the tension draining from his body. Ranger pressed close to his side, unwilling to let the man out of his sight. Grace whistled softly, waving for Ellie to bring supplies from the truck. Ellie knelt by Ranger, reaching out her mittened hand. "Hey boy, you're safe now, okay? We're gonna help you." She patted his head, gentle but sure. Ranger shivered, not from the cold but from the shock of kindness. Ellie grinned, sensing his fear. "It's okay. You're a good boy, aren't you?" Grace scanned Ranger's vest, her breath catching. She traced the faded insignia, her fingers gentle. "That patch, my brother wore the same one. He was K9, stationed in Texas. Lost him to a training accident." Her eyes glistened, but she steadied herself, voice strong. "Nobody's getting left behind tonight." With practiced hands, Grace helped Marcus into the back seat of the truck, Ellie coaxing Ranger up after him. Ranger hesitated, eyes darting between the trees and the open door. Ellie met his gaze, steady and open. "It's okay, boy. Trust me." The warmth inside the cab was a shock after so many hours in the snow. Ranger trembled, huddling on the floor while Grace checked Marcus's wound with a flashlight. She clucked her tongue. "That's nasty, but you're lucky. My husband can patch you up. Hang on." The drive to the lodge was a blur. Trees rushing by, the wind howling, Ranger's senses on overload. Ellie stroked his fur the whole way, talking to him softly about everything and nothing, her school, her dreams, her old dog Max who died the year before. Ranger didn't understand the words, but he felt the sincerity, the simple warmth that radiated from her. At the lodge, lights blazed through the snow, a beacon of hope. Grace's husband, Will Linwood, opened the door, a sturdy man with kind eyes and a trauma kit slung over his shoulder. "Bring him in. Let's see what we're working with." Inside, the world transformed. The lodge was all wood and stone, firelight dancing on the walls, the smell of soup and clean sheets filling the air. Will set to work immediately, cleaning and stitching Marcus's wound, wrapping it tight with practiced efficiency. "You're lucky you didn't lose more blood," he muttered, glancing at Ranger. "And you've got one hell of a guard dog." Grace brewed tea while Ellie brought out a bowl of water and some leftover stew for Ranger, who wolfed it down, hunger overwhelming his caution. Ellie knelt beside him, brushing ice from his fur, whispering, "You're safe now, I promise." Ranger rested his head on her lap, exhaustion finally overtaking him. For the first time since Ben had abandoned him, he let himself close his eyes, letting the warmth, food, and kindness begin to thaw something frozen deep inside him. Meanwhile, Grace examined the insignia on Ranger's vest more closely. "K9 Special Unit," she murmured. "I thought they retired all these dogs years ago." Marcus, groggy but determined, opened the satchel. He showed Grace the flash drive, voice low. "There's proof here, a ring, a program. They're killing these dogs, covering it up. We need help." Grace nodded grimly. "You'll get it." "We won't let them bury this." As the storm raged outside, the Linwoods turned their lodge into a fortress of hope. Ranger curled at Ellie's feet by the fire, watching the Linwoods and Marcus speak in urgent whispers. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope, not just for survival, but for family, for purpose. The snow outside was still deep and deadly, but inside, Ranger had found shelter and, just maybe, a new beginning. The blizzard beat hard against the windows, but inside the Linwood Lodge, the world felt changed. Warmth pulsed from a wood stove and fire crackled in the stone hearth. The yellow glow bounced off rough timber walls, casting every shadow long and gentle. Ranger lay curled at Ellie's feet on a thick blanket, drowsy but watchful. He listened to the hum of voices above him, the sound of hope, thick with fear and urgency. Marcus sat at the big kitchen table, his shoulder and side bandaged, color slowly returning to his cheeks. He looked smaller in the soft light, no longer the hunted shadow in the trees, but a man exhausted by secrets. Grace poured coffee for everyone, her hands steady even as her eyes flickered to the windows, searching for threats. Will Linwood, now finished patching Marcus up, sat across from him, quietly reading a bundle of military documents Marcus had brought. Ellie perched on the rug, stroking Ranger's head and murmuring gentle words of comfort that made his tail thump in slow, sleepy approval. On the table lay the flash drive, the same one Marcus had guarded with his life through the snow. Beside it, stacks of files, faded photos, dog-eared notebooks, and, on a phone screen, a map of the park. Marcus looked at the Linwoods, voice tight but urgent. "Everything you need to blow this open is here. Proof of the disposal program, names, dates, orders, hell, even video. You have to get this out. If you don't, they'll bury it, and us, for good." Grace reached for the flash drive, turning it over in her fingers, frowning at the government label. "You said this program is still running? They're still abandoning K9s, just discarding them like trash?" Marcus nodded. "Dogs like Ranger aren't retired. They're disposed of. My unit found out by accident, overheard orders, saw trucks like the one that dumped him. I started looking deeper. That's when the threats started. Accidents happened. They killed my friend. They tried to kill me." Ellie looked from Marcus to Ranger, her eyes brimming. "But why? Why would anyone do that?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "They say it's about budget, security, protocol. The truth is, it's about erasing problems. Sometimes the dogs know too much. Sometimes the handlers do. Anyone who asks questions, gone." Will's voice was low and hard. "We won't let them get away with it." "Not after what happened to my brother-in-law." He squeezed Grace's hand under the table. Grace straightened, determination in her posture. Marcus slid his battered phone across the table. "I have a contact, Rafael Torres. He's an investigative journalist in Missoula. He's taken down generals before. If anyone can get this to the world, it's him. But someone needs to get him the evidence. Fast. The Linwoods exchanged glances, the kind of silent conversation that came from years of facing trouble side by side. Will nodded. I'll drive out at first light, take the back roads to Missoula. I can be invisible if I have to. Ellie looked down at Ranger, then back at Marcus. What about Ranger? What happens to him? Marcus smiled faintly, tired but grateful. That's up to him. He's not government property anymore. He's family, if he wants it. Ranger looked up at Ellie, reading the worry and hope in her expression. Her hand was gentle on his head, and for the first time in days he felt the ache in his chest ease, replaced by a strange, fragile peace. He shifted closer to her, curling into her warmth. Ellie grinned, pressing her cheek to his fur. For a moment, the heavy talk drifted into the background. Grace handed Ellie a mug of hot chocolate and pressed a warm washcloth to Ranger's ears, humming a lullaby under her breath. The fire snapped and popped, and the wind's howl softened outside the thick log walls. Later, Marcus showed Will and Grace the files, grainy photographs of dogs in kennels, lists of serial numbers, scans of orders marked classified, even a shaky video filmed inside a military van, the faint glint of a K9 vest in the darkness, the same patch Ranger still wore. Ranger watched the flicker of images, ears flat, sensing the tension in the room. These were the ghosts of his past, names and faces he'd known, the smell of antiseptic and fear, the sting of betrayal. As the Linwoods and Marcus pieced together the evidence, their voices sharpened with purpose. Grace fired off an encrypted email to Rafael Torres, attaching the most damning files. Will mapped a safe route to Missoula, marking radio towers and ranger stations along the way, planning for every contingency. Ellie offered her own solution. Let Ranger rest here with me tonight. He's earned it. Ranger, curled at her feet, felt the weight of their attention shift. He was no longer a tool, no longer an asset or a problem to be solved. For the first time since Ben's betrayal, he was just a dog, tired, wounded, but safe. As the night deepened, Grace and Will double-checked the locks and made sure the generator was fueled. They posted watch by the windows, just in case. But for a few blessed hours, the Linwood Lodge was a sanctuary, a place where secrets could be spoken aloud, where the hunted could become the hopeful. In the soft glow of the fire, Ellie dozed beside Ranger, her breath slow and even, her hand curled in his fur. Marcus sat at the table, haunted eyes fixed on the door, but for the first time he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they would make it, that the truth would come out. Ranger slept without fear, lulled by the steady beat of Ellie's heart and the promise of something he'd thought lost forever. Home. Midnight hung heavy over the Linwood Lodge, the storm outside now a low, relentless moan. Inside, the fire's warmth seemed to push back the darkness, but something else crept in, tension, growing thick as frost on the window panes. Ranger dozed fitfully at Ellie's feet, ears twitching at every unfamiliar noise. The Linwoods took turns watching the road through binoculars. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, assembling files and scanning through the phone's encrypted messages, nerves coiled tight as a spring. It started as a flicker on the tree line, small red dots, like eyes, pulsing in the snow. Ellie noticed first, pushing herself up from the blanket. "Mom, Dad, what's that out there?" Will peered out, voice low. "Someone's coming. 2 trucks, maybe more. Headlights are off." Marcus felt his blood run cold. He snatched the flash drive from the table, stuffing it into his jacket. "They found us." Grace moved fast, calm but forceful. "Will, traps. Ellie, radio, get on with search and rescue. Use the emergency code. Marcus, if you can walk, help me reinforce the doors. Ranger, stay with Ellie." Ranger shot to his feet, his body remembering training he hadn't used in months. The adrenaline was instant, pulse pounding, hackles raised, eyes locked on the shadowy shapes closing in from the woods. He moved to Ellie's side as she fumbled with the old radio, trying to recall the code Will had drilled into her so many times but never thought she'd use. Outside, headlights blinked out. Silence. Then, as if on cue, every light in the lodge flickered, then died, leaving only the dull orange glow of the fireplace. The lodge seemed to shrink in the dark. Marcus cursed softly. They cut the power. Grace moved through the blackness like a ghost, gathering flashlights, loading her father's old shotgun. Nobody gets in, not without a fight. Her voice never shook, even as she pressed her hand to Ellie's shoulder for a second longer than usual. We're together. That's what matters. Will slipped outside through the back door, setting makeshift traps, tripwires strung with cans, snow buried with spikes. He worked fast, teeth clenched against the cold, trusting that every minute bought would count. Ranger shadowed him for a heartbeat, then returned to Ellie's side, standing guard as she finally broke through on the radio. Mayday. This is Linwood Lodge, Glacier National, code 8139. Intruders on the property. Please, send help. Repeat, send help. The response was a wall of static. Ellie's hands shook, but her voice stayed steady. I think they heard me, Mom. Outside, boots crunched in the snow, circling. Shadows flitted between trees. A voice called out, cold and amplified, echoing through a bullhorn. Linwoods, we know you're in there. Hand over Marcus Blackwell and the evidence, and nobody gets hurt. Marcus's hands shook as he checked the flash drive in his pocket. Don't believe them. They never planned to let anyone walk out. Grace pressed the shotgun into his hands, handing Will a pistol. We'll hold them off. Ellie, downstairs now. Take Ranger. Ellie nodded, her face pale but eyes blazing. Come on, Ranger, down here. She pulled him into the cellar, past shelves of preserves and stacks of firewood, to the hiding place behind the furnace where she used to play as a child. Stay, she whispered, stroking his head, voice trembling just a little. You're safe, boy. But Ranger was restless. The adrenaline wouldn't let him settle. He listened, nose twitching, to the footsteps moving closer. Upstairs, Grace and Will barricaded the doors, stacking furniture, loading every weapon they had. Marcus slipped into the back room, hunched over an old laptop, trying to upload files to Rafael Torres. His hands left small, wet smears of blood on the keyboard, but he kept working, gritting his teeth against the pain. A sudden crash upstairs, a window shattering. Will fired a warning shot. Voices barked. Another window broke. Cold air knifed through the lodge, sending embers swirling. Ellie flinched, clutching Ranger tighter. Don't leave me, she whispered. Ranger growled, low and deep. It was a sound he hadn't made since before the blizzard, before Ben had left him. In that growl was everything: fear, anger, loyalty. From the shadows, one of the attackers slipped in through the kitchen. Ranger heard him, muscles tightening. Ellie whimpered but didn't move. The man crept down the stairs, gun drawn, light slicing the darkness. He froze when he saw Ranger's eyes, amber and unblinking, fixed on the threat. The man hesitated, gun wavering. In a flash, Ranger lunged, teeth bared. The man stumbled back, firing a wild shot that struck the furnace, sending sparks flying. Ranger tackled him, jaws clamping on the man's arm. The intruder screamed, trying to shake him off, but Ranger held fast. Ellie shouted, "Get him, boy!" as she ducked behind a stack of firewood. The struggle was violent and desperate. The man tried to club Ranger with his pistol, but the dog twisted, latching onto his vest, recognizing a patch from his own unit. For a split second, Ranger's rage burned through his fear. This man had helped betray him, helped dump him in the snow. With a final surge, Ranger dragged the attacker down, pinning him long enough for Will to rush in, disarm him, and tie his hands behind his back. Panting, Ranger backed away, eyes wild but triumphant. He limped to Ellie, pressing against her for comfort. Upstairs, Grace fired another warning shot, and the voices outside began to retreat. Police sirens wailed in the far distance, faint but growing. Marcus, in the back room, finally managed to send the files, just as the attackers outside melted into the storm, knowing the law was almost at the door. In the stillness that followed, the Linwoods, Marcus and Ranger counted their bruises and victories. They had held the line, not with guns or violence alone, but with loyalty, love, and the courage to stand for what mattered. And in the chaos, a wounded dog had proved that even the broken could become protectors once again. The storm's violence began to ebb, but inside the Linwood Lodge, the air was electric with tension, grief, and hope. The floors were slick with melting snow and broken glass. The barricades still stood, battered but unbroken. In the dim light of dawn, the line between natural disaster and human cruelty blurred, a siege both from nature and from men determined to hide their crimes. Marcus pressed a blood-soaked towel to his side, grimacing as Will Linwood checked his stitches. The laptop on the table crackled and flickered. The files had just finished uploading to Rafael Torres. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if the world would hear their truth or if they'd be buried in silence. Grace Linwood stood guard at the door, the old shotgun across her lap, eyes red but fierce. She watched the windows, tracking every shadow. Ellie sat huddled on the floor, arms wrapped around Ranger. Her head rested against his broad chest, her face streaked with tears, her fingers curled tight into his fur. Ranger stayed utterly still, ears trained on the sounds above, every muscle tense. The graze on his shoulder ached, but his focus was all for the girl and the house he'd decided to protect. Outside, police sirens pierced the air, growing steadily louder. But Commander Lee Ellis and his men weren't gone. They circled, desperate and angry. One last push to erase everything, one final chance to silence Marcus and everyone who'd helped him. Ellis's voice thundered through a bullhorn. "Hand over the evidence, or everyone inside dies. That dog is property of the United States." The threat hung in the icy air. Ranger froze, haunted by memories of the night Ben abandoned him. The shame, the fear, the feeling of being nothing more than a tool. He shivered, torn between the instinct to run and the urge to stand his ground. Around him, the house trembled with each distant shot, every window rattling with the wind's fury. Marcus saw the doubt in Ranger's eyes and crawled toward him, wincing. "You're more than what they say you are, boy. More than any order, any patch. Don't let them take that from you." He coughed, eyes pleading. "Ellie needs you." "We all do." Suddenly, glass shattered at the back of the lodge. An armed contractor burst into the room, gun raised, face twisted with adrenaline and fear. Ellie screamed, a thin, broken sound that seemed to freeze time. Ranger's body went rigid, and for a split second, he was back in the blizzard, helpless and betrayed. But this time, Ellie's eyes locked with his, not pleading but trusting, believing. Something inside Ranger snapped back into place. He wasn't a tool, he was a protector. He launched at the intruder, the world narrowing to the violence and the scent of danger. The contractor's gun went off, the bullet grazing Ranger's shoulder, but Ranger didn't stop. He crashed into the man, teeth and muscle driving him to the ground, pinning him until Will could wrench the gun away and tie the man's hands with a length of curtain cord. Ellie sobbed, but she never let go of Ranger. Blood oozed from his shoulder, staining her jeans. She whispered, good boy, I'm here, over and over, as if by sheer will she could keep him alive. Upstairs, Marcus staggered to the laptop, every step agony. He had only moments before Ellis's men would breach the barricades. His hand shook as he typed out the last message. "This is Marcus Blackwell. The truth is out. Do not let them silence us." He clicked send just as the laptop sparked and died, the battery finally giving out. Flashes of gunfire outside lit up the snow. Grace and Will fought to hold the doors. Then, almost suddenly, the sirens were right on top of them. Red and blue lights danced through the trees. Ellis and his men tried to melt away into the woods, but the police were everywhere, shouting, ordering, sweeping through the trees. Will dropped the shotgun, hands raised, and Grace let out a sob of relief. The siege was over. Inside, Ellie cradled Ranger, her face pressed into his fur. Will pulled Marcus to his feet, supporting him as they limped outside. Grace gathered Ellie and Ranger in her arms, holding both as if she would never let go. In the aftermath, as the authorities took control and paramedics streamed in, Marcus slumped in a chair, pale but alive. He was loaded into an ambulance, promising to testify, to see this fight through. Grace and Will watched as the evidence was logged and the wounded were tended. For a moment, the world felt clean, as if a bitter, freezing wind had finally blown the poison away. But Ranger's journey was not over. He limped to the porch, standing in the open morning air, watching the mountains slowly emerge from the thinning storm. His body ached, his shoulder throbbed, but his eyes were different, no longer dulled by pain and fear, but bright with a sense of belonging. Ellie joined him, sitting quietly beside him. She didn't speak, just placed her hand on his head and breathed with him, the two of them feeling the world tilt toward hope. Inside, Grace stared at the evidence Marcus had left behind, pictures of dogs, files, videos, names. The truth was out. But what mattered more was what had happened in her home. A wounded man had risked everything to expose evil. A family had chosen to protect instead of hide. And a discarded dog had found the courage to trust, to fight, and to love again. Sacrifice is not just about taking a bullet. It's about choosing, again and again, to do the right thing when it would be easier to give up. Marcus's courage in exposing the truth, Grace's decision to risk her family for justice, and Ranger's return to the role of protector despite his trauma are acts of redemption born from pain. True healing comes not from victory, but from connection. The scars will remain for Marcus, Ranger, and the Linwoods. But so will the bonds they forged in the fire, bonds of trust, courage, and family. Evil thrives on silence. Justice is born the moment someone stands up and says, "No more." The siege at the lodge was more than a battle for survival. It was the moment when secrets were dragged into the light and love proved stronger than fear. And as the sun finally rose over the battered lodge, Ranger and Ellie watched together, knowing the fight wasn't over, but that they would face whatever came next, side by side. The sun crested over the mountain ridge, painting Glacier National Park in gold and pink. The storm had passed, leaving a world scrubbed clean, fresh snow gleaming under the first real blue sky anyone at the Linwood Lodge had seen in days. The aftermath of the siege was everywhere. Shattered glass, muddy boot prints, the smell of gun oil lingering in the corners, but it was over. There was a hush to the morning, the fragile quiet that follows a night when everything could have been lost. Ranger lay on the porch, his wounded shoulder freshly bandaged, head on Ellie's lap. She read aloud from her favorite book, her voice gentle, the words drifting into the cold air like a promise. Every so often she would pause to scratch his ear or press her cheek into his fur. Ranger's eyes, once clouded with fear, now shone with a wary contentment, a dog finally at rest. Inside, the Linwoods worked quietly, sweeping up glass, making phone calls, setting things right as best they could. Marcus Blackwell was already gone, airlifted before sunrise, still pale but determined, gripping Will's hand with quiet gratitude as they loaded him into the helicopter. "Don't let them forget," he'd whispered to Grace. "Don't let them forget these dogs." The flash drive, now in the hands of Rafael Torres and his team, had done its work. By midday, headlines flashed across the country. Hero dogs betrayed by military. Whistleblower reveals canine disposal ring. Rangers fight for survival exposes national scandal. Who protects our protectors? Journalists swarmed Missoula. Rafael Torres himself arrived at the lodge with a cameraman and notepad, careful to keep his distance, respectful of the Linwoods' battered peace. He interviewed Grace and Will on the porch, capturing their outrage, their love, and their fierce refusal to be cowed by threats. Ellie refused to speak on camera, but she sat beside Ranger, arm draped protectively around him, her presence louder than any words. The government scrambled, investigations opened, whistleblower protections were promised. The military sent an officer to thank the Linwoods, but Grace met him at the door with a glare that left no doubt what kind of welcome opportunists would find at her home. All across the country, veterans, dog handlers, and animal advocates rallied to demand change. Old stories resurfaced, forgotten heroes, abandoned partners, wounds no metal could heal. Ranger's story became the spark that lit a national reckoning, but the most important changes happened quietly, far from the cameras. In the lodge, Ranger found his rhythm. He watched Will repair a shattered window with a steady, gentle patience that reminded him of old barracks life. He learned the pattern of Grace's footsteps in the kitchen, her laughter soft but resilient. At night, he'd lie by the fire, Ellie's hand always nearby, as she told him stories and whispered secrets she'd never told anyone else. She brushed the scars beneath his fur, not flinching, not asking him to forget, just accepting him, broken parts and all. The nightmares didn't disappear. Some nights Ranger would jolt awake, panting, lost in the blizzard of memory, Ben's face, the snap of a leash, the cold that seemed endless. But every time, Ellie would be there, arms wrapped tight around his neck, anchoring him in the present. "You're safe, Ranger. You're home. I got you." In the days that followed, neighbors brought food and supplies, wordlessly folding the Linwoods and their new dog into the greater community. Kids from the town came to meet the hero dog, but Ellie was always nearby, making sure Ranger was never overwhelmed, never put on display. He was no longer a tool, no longer evidence. He was family. Will would sometimes kneel beside Ranger in the yard, tools in hand, and scratch behind his ears. "Took a lot to get you here, old boy," he'd say quietly. "Glad you stuck around." Grace would join them, a mug of coffee in her hands, gaze steady on the horizon. "You belong here, Ranger." "You always did." When the government finally offered to retrieve Ranger, the Linwoods answered with a letter signed by half the county, making it clear Ranger was no longer government property. He was theirs. More than that, he was his own, free at last to choose loyalty, not just live it. One morning after the worst had passed, Ellie found Ranger on the porch, eyes locked on the sunrise. She sat down beside him, silent for a while, and then said, "I think you saved us as much as we saved you, Ranger." She pressed her face to his neck. "You showed me what real courage is. True worth isn't measured by service, or by medals, or by how useful someone is to those in power. It's found in being seen and loved, not just for what you can do, but for who you are." Ranger's journey, discarded as a problem, found as a friend, proved that dignity is intrinsic, that every life has meaning. Healing from betrayal is never quick. It comes not from a single act of bravery, but from countless small acts of kindness, moments of trust, and a willingness to try again even when the world has failed you. Ranger's scars did not disappear, but in the slow turning of days he found belonging, one meal, one touch, one sunrise at a time. Justice isn't only the domain of courts and headlines. It lives in ordinary courage, the choice to protect the vulnerable, to speak the truth, to form a pack with those who need us most, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Loyalty is not blind obedience, but the brave, conscious act of standing up for what's right, especially when it's hard. And as Ranger lifted his head to the sky, feeling the warmth on his muzzle, he knew, without words, that the old world was gone. In its place, a new pack, a new beginning, and a family who would never, ever let him be abandoned again.